Good morning, everyone. My name is Hugh Mangan. I work with the Ordnance Survey Ireland in the Business and Marketing Department. I've been with the Ordnance Survey for almost exactly 9 years now. My background is not within the industry. There's times with my own groups of friends when I explain what I do, I feel like quite an expert in GIS, but actually standing in a room with people like you, I don't. I feel like a business person. But I think that gives me a different perspective on the industry in some ways, and it echoes some of the things that Tom raised there, and I'd like to address those in a little bit more detail. But this question of value that was raised quite succinctly actually at last year's Ordnance Conference by Paul Simmet of Esri is actually a burning question for our industry. And OSI is probably like a lot of public sector bodies. We actually, it's a little bit like the Oscar Wilde quote, we actually know the cost of everything, but if you ask us about the value of things, it gets difficult to actually articulate that. And that's a challenge for us, and it's something that we need to work on. And that'll become clear as I go through my presentation. So, but just to set the scene, I mean, geography does underpin everything. If you look to last year's census results, it was the first time in our history that the census was collected at a household level and then disseminated at a small area level. And that provided for an average of a 6 times finer analysis than was ever previously available before. Geography underpins a lot of what happens in the agricultural industry, in the utility industry, and in the telecommunications industry. It's enabling some of the renewable energy projects that are ongoing. It's used within the Property Registration Authority. It's used by our banks, both good ones and bad ones. It's used within flooding, and it's used within the Water Framework Directive. And last week we had an announcement of a new viewer that's gone into the educational sector. And it's used by retailers to help them understand things about their business. And it's used within the tourist industry. And I have some paper maps up there, and I think later on Beverly from Fáilte Ireland will show you where their use of geographic data has got to. So location matters to government, and actually I've been driving around the country recently visiting our customers, and in an hour in a car you will hear conversations about water metering and Irish Water and the household charge and the property tax and septic tanks and postcodes. And we think of those as location problems because they have a real high degree of spatial complexity in them. Recently, the government announced a C-government strategy, and for the first time ever, I think, written down in a government policy document, did I see a direct reference to digital mapping and the use of GIS. And we all have to engage with GIS to deliver efficiencies for our organisation. And we all know about the Inspire Directive and the onus that puts on us. And within that e-government document, the government made reference to an open data policy document that will be coming out at some stage over the next few months. Since then, they followed it up with a cloud computing document. All of those things are shaping the industry that we live in. But in order to get to that value question, you need to understand where things are. And location matters to citizens. Anyone here in the local authority sector will immediately reference some of these things. We did a piece of research recently asking people what were, among other things, but asking them what were the negative factors that influenced where they live. And there they are: flooding, traffic, industrial sites, ghost estates. And this newspaper clipping was in the Irish Times just a couple of weeks ago, where a Wicklow resident in Ockram literally took out his digger and dug a trench in the road to protect his house from flooding. So location is actually very important. And that brings me on. I want to talk to you about your National Mapping Agency and what we look like today. And we have a reasonably kind of simple role, and that role is to maintain and develop the underlying physical infrastructure of the state so that it can be used in the mapping applications that you work with on a daily basis. We're required to create consistent, homogeneous and maintain digital databases of large-scale topographical data. And we all know how that's used, but it should be used to optimize resources, deliver efficiencies, and help government and businesses and individuals make better decisions. And this is what OSI has. I mean, if you look at OSI as an organization, we have two core capabilities. One is around a data collection expertise and one is around a data management expertise. But we have about 250 staff at the moment, like yourselves. Croke Park has taken quite a toll on us. We've lost 20% of our people over the last year. But of that 150 people, 150 of them are involved in making maps. So we're not unlike a map production facility. 12% of them are actually field survey staff, and 8% of them are our IT staff required to support all of those. The map-making process begins in the air with remote sense data. It finishes up in the field where, if we can't capture details using that remote sense data, and it's brought into our graphic operators who database the information, that goes out through our supply systems. So over 80% of our organization is geared towards making and supplying maps. And we have all of that data as a digital data holding, right from the very first maps of Ireland up to the ones that we're making today. So we currently manage around 280 terabytes or more of data, and we're adding to that by 40 terabytes on an annual basis. And so developments in the cloud are attractive to us as an organization. We are a European reference site for the use of Oracle spatial technology. And we have a data center in the Phoenix Park and in our regional offices, our web services delivered off the Amazon cloud. And this is what we produce. Most of our work happens in the top left-hand corner in the large-scale data. That's where we do most of our activity, and some of those other products are derived. Our remote sensing programs capture imagery and LiDAR data, which is detailed height information. And we have responsibility for the boundary data sets of the states. But increasingly, how we deliver all of that is delivered out through our web services directly into your organizations. So the industry that we work in is changing quite fast. It was 2005 when Google Earth was first launched. That's 7 years ago. It's phenomenal to think of that, of the change that's happened in the industry since that time. And it's a global brand now. I've put our own Map Genie in there. I'm not too sure we can compete on a global stage, but it's in there anyway. But the industry is undergoing this tremendous change from being about back office systems to being about location data being collected and available everywhere. And you see that quote there from Cisco about there being 15 billion internet connected devices by 2015. All of those will have some sort of location capabilities. So much so that the United Nations has recently convened a committee of experts on geospatial information management. So very often we're focused on the directives as they land on our desk, but actually they begin somewhere else. And at the moment they're beginning to start out in the United Nations, who recognize the value of this. That transcends down into the EU and into the state, and then we get the directives. And they have identified these kind of 5 core change areas that we will see dramatic changes over the next 5 to 10 years, and I'll just go through those now. My own opinion is actually we're seeing some of those changes already. It's already happened. And actually, it was interesting to hear Garreau talk about how their organization has changed. And you'll see that as the private sector partners are able to respond much more quickly to these changes to take advantage of them. So we've spoken about the data capture devices. And that'll generate both active and passive capture, so people who want to capture and people who are doing it anyway by just checking in at particular locations. And it'll create huge amounts of data, enormous data. And it'll create a world where there's accurate, authoritative data and crowdsourced data available. We'll see the rise of open source, we'll see linked data and cloud computing all having impacts upon the organization. In OSI, actually this summer we undertook some trials around indoor positioning. The technology is not quite there yet, but we are doing it. And in terms of professional data capture, that's all going to change. It's now 3D, it'll go to 4D, but UAVs will play a big role, and mobile computing will play an increasingly bigger role as well. And all of these changes are coming down the line at us. If you look at the legal and policy types of change as well, open data will challenge the industry and challenge traditional funding models within that industry. The way data is collected will challenge the way we actually legalize and create policy frameworks around that. Things like standards, quality, liability will become important. From a technology provider perspective, increasingly the private sector will be the outsourced partners. They'll be doing the bits that government can no longer do. From a skills perspective, again, Tom spoke about the need to communicate. But as GIS professionals, it will be your responsibility to communicate. And then in terms of the government role, how is that going to change? Increasingly, the government are going to be asked to facilitate and collaborate between organisations, to provide the policy frameworks and the spatial reference frameworks within which data can be collected. And this slide might be hard to see, but I've tried to capture within it all of those changes that might impact us as a national mapping agency. So we have things like policy and legal framework, privacy standards, and liability as well. So as more and more data gets collected and more people rely on it, it won't necessarily be the case that people making decisions on that will accept a no liability clause on the data. Geospatial infrastructures will become paramount and they'll be relied on by communities. And within that, the authoritative nature of data will become important. And of course, we have open source and open data, and that will be increasingly seen as a public good. That challenges us about how we're going to fund the collection of that data. And you can't fund the collection of that data unless you made the business case for the value of it in the first instance. And OSI and other national mapping agencies will be asked to facilitate this greater collaboration and the integration of data sets from different organisations and not the ones that exist now. So OSI into the future, well, there is a need for this common referencing framework because there's going to be these established sources of information. There will be different users, there will be different applications, and the challenge will be to establish principles within which all of this information is accessible and connectable. And so OSI is undertaking a complete restructuring of its database, a project we refer to as Prime 2, but we've created a new storage model that will allow this data to be managed effectively in it. It's a database of real-world objects, it's seamless and it's object-based. And for the first time ever, OSI has the ability to manage not just our own data, but reference other people's data as well. It's due to be completed by June 2013, and it's a huge undertaking. It's certainly the most significant change we've taken. Why is it required? Well, I think we know why it's required, because we have to have these open and robust data models. There has to be greater consistency and integration, and it has to be a standards-based approach to the provision of spatial data. So Prime 2 enables all of this linking. It has an ability to give everything a globally unique ID. It has the ability and has full network connectivity across roads and rivers. It allows us to supply data in new ways. It allows you to consume data in new ways, not just by tiles, but by teams. It allows us to manage metadata on objects, not down to an object level, but actually down to the attribute level on that object. And how will we make that available? Well, that data will be made available as a web service increasingly. That's what people want from us. We have the capabilities internally within OSI to manage and host this data. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense for other people to build those capabilities up to do what we're already doing. So increasingly we expect that our web services will be relied on by people in terms of consuming this data. And so how might that future look? Well, that future might look like OSI as a trusted custodian for the national core reference data sets. And within that, it has the ability to reference any other type of national coverage spatial data and provide globally unique links to that data and store them. So that means when a local authority gets a data set from us, they understand where all of the utility information is without necessarily having to go to the utility companies and get that themselves. You're probably all familiar with the public sector reform. There is a proposal on the table to merge us with the Valuation Office and the Property Registration Authority. We don't know what the story is there, although we probably do expect some announcement to happen by the end of the year. But that, in the immediate term, might change the perspective in the industry. And what can we do in the interim? Well, we've got to continue, like yourselves, to reduce our operating costs. We've got to get everything we can online. We've got to move up this value chain, and we've got to establish the value of the data to not just your business, but to the country as a whole. And we've got to continue to create the environment within which that authoritative data is recognised. So in 5 to 10 years, our role will certainly change, absolutely definitively change, but it will still remain vital. Okay, thank you very much.